Welcome to the History Slam podcast from ActiveHistory.ca. Here is your host, Sean Graham.
Thank you, Adam. Welcome to the History Slam, everybody. I am Sean Graham. We're coming at you today nearly live. We're in Ottawa, Ontario, actually down at the campus of Carleton University. It's the first time we've headed down to the south side of the city for the podcast. With the holidays coming up and people getting together with their families and spending some quality time together, at least for the first couple hours of being together, we thought it'd be a good idea to talk about a new project from the Workers' History Museum, which is a new documentary and traveling exhibit on the history of family leave. So today we have from Carleton University, law professor here, member of the movement and an expert on early feminist unions in British Columbia, Rosemary Warskett. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks.
And also here, a former union rep and a bargaining team member for the CR Group and the Public Service Alliance of Canada during critical negotiations for family leave, and an active member of the Workers' History Museum, one of the founders of this project, Arthur Carkner. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Sean.
So before we start, let's just dive in a little bit to the project. About a month ago, there was the launch of the documentary, I know, which was I was fortunate enough to be invited and had a great time. But in general, what is the Family Leave Project?
The Family Leave Project has existed for 3 years, and what we've been trying to do is research and document for the entire issue of struggling around family leave. And in family leave, we use an inclusive definition. One of the key struggles was the struggle for paid maternity leave. Not everyone would be aware that Canada has the best paid maternity leave on earth, and Norway is second at 44 weeks, and that in the United States they currently have 0 weeks of paid maternity leave. So how does it happen that two countries in many ways so similar could end up in such a different outcome? So we looked at some of the early struggles. For example, the postal workers had a 42-day strike in the 1980s. And when we look at workers' history, we can't really afford to take the point of view that history is 100 or 150 years ago. It's great that the anniversary of the Winnipeg General Strike will come up in 2019, but many of the voices that we wish to capture and many of the people we wish to interview were involved in struggles 20 years ago, 30 years ago, even contemporary struggles, because family leave is an ongoing issue. Bob Hatfield, who's the president of the museum, and myself both can't really claim credit for the idea of the documentary because we both wanted to do a video which would be suitable for educational material and for general interest. We also did a traveling exhibit with the support of other people in the museum, and it's been to a number of conventions, it's been to a number of meetings, office buildings, and so forth. I guess if I could use the slogan, we're the museum that delivers. We don't actually have a building with marble pillars and tour bus parking. What we try and do is web-based work, traveling exhibit work, video work, and lastly, developing educational material. We were fortunate enough to have a student, Kayla Pegg, who worked this summer on developing course material for high schools and for university courses, and Bob is working on union courses, where we'll talk about the important issue of family leave, and in saying it's a broad definition of family, we wish to be inclusive. It's not only maternity leave, it's leave for fathers, it's custom adoption for Aboriginals, it's bereavement leaves for GLBT couples, so we try to purposely make it broad.
Yeah, which was sort of what I was interested in when I went to see the documentary. I thought in my own head of what it was going to be, and it turned out to be different than what you guys were actually talking about, in that obviously the initial focus of the documentary at least was on maternity leave, but then it turns in the later years into the focus of, like you say, with gay and lesbian couples, not only bereavement but adoption for them, other adopted parents, and leave for fathers as well. So in defining family leave, is there one way to define it, or is it just sort of a broad term that we can use to describe the need to attend to family issues?
Just breaking the words down, in the definition of family, we tried to have a broad and inclusive definition of families. There are many kinds of families in our society. We tried not to exclude anyone. And in terms of leave, it has to do with someone who's in a work situation, who's getting time off work, not time off to rest, which is vacation leave, not time off for themselves, which might be personal day off, not time off because they're ill, which would be sick leave. But specifically, leave where it relates to something about your family, whether it be a medical appointment, whether it be an aged parent who's perhaps in a terminal illness. And so in looking at that, I think that no one has really taken this optic before. No one has really tried to take the inclusive definition which unions struggle for in collective agreement language, and apply it as a social norm.
With this movement then and the push for family leave, is there really a place? I know you mentioned that you don't want to look at history as something that's only happened in the last 150 years or 100 years. Is there a defining starting moment for this particular movement and the push to family leave, do you think?
Well, I think the defining moment is probably after the Second World War, in the 50s, going into the 60s, when the women's movement really got revitalized. There had been earlier women's movements, but those earlier movements were perhaps more focused on voting rights rather than women in the workplace. And so you can think about the pressure that women brought to bear on the federal liberals of the day to create a royal commission on the status of women. That was a commission in the 60s. It started in 67, and there was a lot of pressure on the Liberal government at that time, because a lot of women in the Liberal Party were really pressuring for all kinds of investigation into equality issues at that time. And the Royal Commission on the Status of Women also took a different approach, and it went across the country, meeting with groups of women in various, not only women, people in communities, asking about the status of women. So one of the recommendations that came out of that Royal Commission was paid maternity leave. Well, maternity leave, because there wasn't even really time off,
right,
in any sense at that time, but also to have a leave which women wouldn't lose money in the workplace. And what's really, I think, positive about this video is how many women in the video talk about when they had children, and there was no leave, and the difficulty that they faced, trying to stay in the workplace, and which they had to for economic reasons. And at the same time be part of having a family,
right,
and how difficult it was without that paid maternity leave.
So then would you say that Royal Commission then is maybe the first time that the concept of maternity leave is really put in official terms?
It had been an issue, especially in Quebec, because Quebec was one of the first provinces to get a paid maternity leave from the fight by the Common Front, but also in BC. The Association of, I can't remember quite.
University and college.
Employees. Also, they got it in their agreements, but it was in the 1970s. So I think that probably the Royal Commission probably was the beginning, but I think the Commission didn't get there without women,
right,
and women in unions and women in political parties pushing for that commission to happen. So it didn't just come down from the Liberal Party from above.
Right.
It was because people actually mobilised and pressured for that commission that came into being.
So much more of a bottom-up situation.
And what is interesting about that commission, it was a very broad-based commission. So obviously it was looking at both women in the home and the inequality in the home, the inequality in the workplace, the relationship between the two spheres, home and work, and what women really needed to allow them to participate equally in both spheres, both in the home and in the workplace.
Right. And in terms of some of these people in the government, a big factor or a big figure was Grace Mckenna in the early 1970s, right?
Grace Mckenna was originally a CCF member and then an NDP member, and she'd been very active in women's struggles. She was identified as one of the 100 women in history was most important by Marie Claire magazine, for example. She came from Gibsons, BC, and she was active in the struggle, and as an NDP member of Parliament, she brought in private members' bills repeatedly in 1968, 1969, and 1970, asking for paid maternity leave for workers. And the issue of leave is important because leave means you get to come back. And in many jobs that existed before, for example, if you were a school teacher and you began to show that you were pregnant, you had to leave. And leaving meant resigning. It didn't mean going on leave with a guaranteed return to your job. It meant bye-bye.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting, too, in the documentary how a lot of the women were talking about their own experience in these workplaces and having to either resign or make some sort of decision. That it's almost an impossible decision. Like, what do you do? I mean, economically, you need your job, just to help support your family. But if you can't do it while you're pregnant and they're not going to give you leave, I mean, there's really nothing you can do. And for some of them, it came across as it was almost a hopeless situation for them in a time that should have been a happy time when you're pregnant, right? You should be looking forward to and excited about your family and your growing family, but instead it was just full of stress and uncertainty. And I thought that came across really well in the documentary. And I think it's really remarkable, too, that in the 1970s with Grace McKinnis, none of those bills obviously get passed because they're private members' bills. But the fact that she continued, it wasn't just one bill that she introduced, it was multiple bills. Mm-hmm. And sort of that shows the strength or the desire, at least on her part, and then reflected in the movement by the unions, that this is really an important thing. But obviously it wasn't all happy and cheery. Through the 1970s, and Rosemary, you talked about this, not just in the film, but at the discussion after the premiere, that while you're in the midst of this movement and pushing for family leave, amongst other things within the movement and the feminist movement, you have to deal with a lot of red baiting and feminist baiting. Mm-hmm. Now, as an individual, just at a human level, how do you deal with those sorts of personal attacks?
Well, it's interesting because, of course, in the union movement, that was very much in the 70s, and I was in a small, I had been in the Waffle, I was in a small sort of socialist group, came out of the Waffle, and plus I was increasingly part of the women's movement, and when I got my job in the Public Service Alliance of Canada, the union which organizes federal public employees, the sort of Cold War in the union movement wasn't so terrible in the PSAC. They weren't such big red baiters, but I think as they became the PSAC, the irony of it, as they became a more progressive union, in fact, and became more integrated into the union movement, they then, certain people were pointed at as being on the left and perhaps causing a problem for the union movement. So I, and then as I got more involved in the feminist movement, then you got this sort of flung at you that you were just interested in one issue, women. How did I deal with it? I don't think I often dealt with it very well, in actual fact. It's interesting, and in fact, I think it was one of the reasons I did eventually leave the PSAC and actually went back, did my PhD and went to academia, which, that doesn't happen in the academy at all because the stakes aren't the same. Right. The stakes in a union movement are very high in terms of how are we going to strategize, how are we going to mobilize, and so. If you're accused of being too feminist or you're accused of being too left, then some powers that be, you're really what you're doing is actually questioning how they're leading the movement, and so I think looking back, I feel I should have been far more open about my politics and my feminism that I was. I regret that I wasn't, but that's life, and we learn from it all. And I certainly don't. Everywhere I go, I don't hesitate to say I'm a feminist socialist.
Right. So it's not something that after a rally or a picket or anything that when these attacks were launched at you that you would all go back and sit and have a drink and sort of laugh at them and take them maybe nonchalantly, or because it seems as though you're saying like you didn't maybe process it in the way that you would have liked.
Well, it was it was often a hidden attack too. I don't know how you saw it, Arthur, but often the attacks weren't. I was working in the same office with Arthur, and often the attacks weren't as explicit. Right. Sometimes it was, but often it would mean that you weren't, you were excluded from certain activities, or not, told you shouldn't go and be at the forefront of doing something. Right. So it wasn't often, just we don't have Reds here, or or feminists. It didn't work like that. I don't know how you saw it.
I guess I saw that there was red baiting and there was feminist baiting. In my own experience, when I look out the window from Carleton University, I see the taxation center where I started off as a mailboy, as a clerk in one of the lowest paid jobs. So I hadn't come into the movement through taking university courses in labor relations. I didn't have that background. And I found that the red baiting tactics and the feminist baiting tactics were very divisive, they were very destructive. Initially, because I'd come up through the ranks as a rank and file member, perhaps I had some Teflon in the union. Perhaps people didn't, try and say, well, you're not an authentic member of the union, because in many cases I'd been there and I'd done it and I'd pushed the mail cart, so it was difficult to make that case. As the years went on and the Teflon wore thin, there certainly, when I looked at the activities of the security services, going after activists in the apartheid struggle, going after union activists, when I became aware of the extensive security service that activities around the Canadian Union of Postal Workers, who are featured in our video, it was appalling. And in a personal sense, I didn't process it very well either. I found it very difficult, and I guess it seems trite, but I found it disappointing. I thought the Canadian society was better than that, and I didn't think that we needed to pay people and give them pensions and cars with flashing lights so they could go around following people who are trying to negotiate paid maternity leave.
How much of this is influenced by a Cold War mentality in the 1970s?
Yeah, I think very much the red baiting was very influenced by that kind of mentality. I think the Canadian Labour Congress and the earlier struggles of the Canadian Labour Congress coming out of the Trades and Labour Congress, there were Cold War warriors who really went after the Reds under the bed and saw them as being destructive to the labour movement. And I don't think, I think that's, for the most part, is gone now because of that whole Cold War history is somewhat behind us. I'm not saying there aren't sort of right politics for some people over other kinds of politics, but I don't think it has the bite that it had in those early days of the labour movement. And I think Arthur's right. I was a staffer. I was not a member. I was a staff person in the union, and I think that did make a difference in some respects. But nevertheless, I did see I did see members being attacked. Certainly, I can think of a member who I know who had been in the Communist Party who was thoroughly attacked. By leadership in his component,
Which is really, it's interesting for me is just looking at it obviously from an outsider point of view, but on all of these discussions within unions, and I've been to a few union meetings from the unions that I've been in, the discussion is always that we have to approach it as like a business perspective, and we're engaging in these negotiations and pushing for these movements, but at the same time, and I've seen it at the meetings I've gone to, that a lot of times it for some reason devolves into these personal attacks, which seems to maybe even weaken the resolve of the union or the whole idea of unity and pushing forward with this as a solid group in engaging with the employers or whoever it is that you're dealing with. And it seems very counterproductive to engage in this behavior.
No argument there, Sean.
Yeah. So moving out of the 1970s then and into the 1980s, the documentary makes the point that the postal worker strikes in the 1980s is a critical point for the family rights or the family leave movement. And so how did things change with the postal worker strikes?
Well, the postal workers made paid maternity leave one of their key demands in their 1981 set negotiations. And postal workers have an interesting way of bargaining. They put a package endorsed by the members, and they go to the bargaining table wanting that, all that package dealt with. I mean, maybe 8 key demands. So this demand for paid maternity leave wasn't their only demand or their main demand, but it became part of the package. There were certain women within the postal workers, particularly from BC, who had seen that out in BC, the Association of Universities and College Educators had achieved paid maternity leave. So they brought that to the postal workers. So it became part of the demands that must be achieved in this round of bargaining and backed up by a 42-day strike. And they won it. And that had a tremendous impact on the union that Arthur and I were working with. Arthur was a member at that point, and so he was on the bargaining team of the clerks. But the clerks, just prior to the round in which Arthur was negotiating that issue had really gained status and power within the union. Before they had gone on a strike 2 days, but there were earlier strikes which were unofficial strikes, which the leadership didn't sanction. And the members, as I said when we were at the meeting the other day, just literally ran past leadership. So here we had a group that had made gains in that strike in 1980. They hadn't made the gain of the paid maternity leave, but when they saw the postal workers achieving this in 81, they were ready. That fired that whole side of the clerks. They were 75% of those clerks were women, although there were a lot of male clerks. There were 25% men. But when they came to the next round of bargaining, which would have been then Arthur in 81, 82, that issue then became front and center. And so the influence first of all, it was the influence of the BC workers in that small union, but also the Common Front in Quebec had also made gains on paid maternity, the Common Front of Public Sector Workers in Quebec. So all those examples then fed into this movement of federal public sector workers who saw that and learned from it. It's a learning process,
Sure.
in the union movement, it's an education process when you see it. And when you're out on the picket line talking about these, that's where education often takes place around these kinds of issues. That fed in then to the round of bargaining for the clerical workers in 81, 82.
In many cases in Canadian labour history, it's been maybe one plant has had a strike, people go down, they rent a hockey arena, they have a big meeting, they yell at each other, they come up with a position, they go ahead. For federal clerks, it was quite different. There were 52,000 members in the bargaining unit, and it was spread from coast to coast to coast. So when we had our first strike, there were more attention being focused on issues like a cost of living adjustment, on issues of just plain low pay. And many other federal groups had risen more quickly over time, and the postal workers, as an example, were very important. So in the 1980 round, when we had the strike, we did get payment for the 2 weeks of the waiting period, or what we really thought of as a penalty period before you could get unemployment insurance. But one thing that I think Aaron Floresco, our filmmaker, captured very well is the whole aspect of it being a movement movie. Sometimes people think unions are like businesses. We're competing and they have a brighter bumper and we have a better headlight. But in the whole struggle for paid maternity leave, there were certainly members of the PSAC who were out on picket lines showing support for postal workers. There were people from feminist groups on those same picket lines, and when we had strikes, people from other unions would come out to us. In the influence of the Quebec members, because it was a federal union, there were Quebec members on the bargaining teams, and after the Common Front success, they just said, why wouldn't we do this? We already have this in Quebec, why doesn't everybody in Canada have this? So there were practical examples that people could bring, there were success stories that people could bring, and so to go back to the idea of a movement movie, we tried to capture that sense that it wasn't a competitive process, it was a cooperative process, and if other people in another union got a success, we didn't think, oh geez, they got it before us, we thought that's excellent, now we have a better argument and a better argument yet. The other thing was that having had the clerical strike in 1980, it was no longer possible for the federal government to claim that the only union that ever went on strike was the Canadian Union of Postal Workers. And there was a definite fear when the politicians saw literally tens of thousands of people from the public service on strike that it was going to have an effect on their next re-election. So when the postal workers had their 1981 strike, it is true that they were leading the charge in terms of making paid maternity leave a priority, and that changed our context in the next round, but it's also true that having our strike changed their context because there had been a broader support for strike activity in the federal government.
Right, so rather than it just being another point in bargaining, it's a larger movement and something that people are passionate about. So it's not just a union talking point in a meeting. It's a national movement that engages a lot of different groups.
I guess what Jean-Claude Perrault pointed out, who's the leader of that strike, was that even on the rant radio or right-wing radio programs, people were phoning up and saying, what's the problem with paid maternity leave? The issue wasn't the strike, the issue was the issue. And he said that's the first time he remembered the issue being debated in public rather than the strike being the point.
Because it's an issue that, I mean, when you think about it, and maybe it's just because I'm so much removed from just the time period, is that it seems just the natural. Something like maternity leave, like you have a baby and you're going to need time off.
Yes.
To take care of that baby. I mean, so why should you lose your job? And so I like that it's an issue that everyone can get on board. And I like the way that the movie presents it as this movement, as opposed to just another issue in negotiating. Mm-hmm. I think it's really well done in that respect. But the movie also makes a big deal about Quebec, and you both mentioned Quebec a little bit. The takeaway I got from it was that maybe Quebec was almost like the linchpin, and that the success in Quebec maybe was perhaps even unexpected from the unions within Quebec, and that helped to spur the movement nationally, and that was a big win. Am I fair in thinking that?
Well, I don't know if it was unexpected. I mean, it at that time in the 70s and 80s, and even today, Quebec has always been more highly unionized than the rest of Canada, and certainly has fought for broad issues, not these sort of increases in pay, right. bread and butter issues. Mm-hmm. So I think the union movement at that time, and going forward even, looked to Quebec as being at the forefront often of these kinds of issues, and certainly the women's movement in Quebec, both within the union movement and outside, have made incredible achievements which we haven't been able to do in English Canada. For instance, in terms of childcare, paid childcare, the $7 a day started off as $5 a day. Childcare, I mean, just across the river from here. Right. And now, the Parti Québécois has just come in and is now committed to increase, the big criticism has often been under the Liberal government in Quebec that you can't get a place, you have to put your child's name down on the waiting list before they're born. But now that the commitment now, both in the PQ, but of course pushed by the union movement, is to increase those places, to make it a reality that everybody can get $7 a day childcare. So, those kinds of issues that the union movement in Quebec has pushed very strongly for, because there's a link between, just having legislation that means you can't get fired or you have to leave when you get pregnant. Then, of course, if you get paid for your means you are able to stay within the paid labour force. Mm-hmm. But of course, if you have paid childcare, which is a reasonable cost, it's not, often the woman is lower paid than the man. It doesn't mean that, it makes it worth her while to stay in the paid labour force. Right? I mean, if you're paying the kind of money that you have to pay in Ontario for childcare, people often say, well, there's no point staying in the paid labour force. Right. So, because it's prohibitively expensive, especially if you have two kids. Mm-hmm.
It remains true to this day that Quebec has many benefits that other parts of Canada don't. For one thing, they have a government regime that has contributions from employers, and you don't have to be a union member to get many of the leaves. And many of the top-ups and other kinds of leaves that people get in the rest of Canada, you can simply get there if you're working anywhere. For example, there's 5 weeks of paternity leave, and there's no parallel for that in the rest of Canada, 5 weeks of paid paternity leave. Now, the accusation is made that too many of the men go moose hunting with the 5 weeks of leave. I hope that's a minority of them. But I don't mean to diminish the fact that there continue to be real differences and positive differences in the Quebec model. It does get complicated by the national issue and by the fact that, for example, one of their current issues is the attempt to repatriate money, as they call it, from the federal unemployment scheme so that they can have a broader compassionate leave scheme. There is some compassionate leave under the federal law for employment insurance, but with the problems that we have of the sandwich generation, where many people find themselves dealing with childcare and with elderly parents who have medical needs, the compassionate leave isn't enough. So in a way, it's been kind of a bit of a teeter-totter back and forth. There's the press for increased benefits, but it's also the sense that there's more of a consensus in Quebec society, even among the Employers' Council, that family benefits and family leave are just an accepted part of life, and if they could get the rest of Canada out of the way, they would rather just have the money administer on their own schemes. And that makes it difficult, and makes it complicated, but the model is very strong there.
One thing that also came up in the documentary was that obviously these unions and this movement is not just women, and that men are involved heavily. And I think maybe one of my favorite part of the documentary was, I can't remember who it was, but it was one of the francophones. Says he was one of the leaders. He got a phone call from a man who said, "Are we really going to go on strike because of maternity leave?"
I think it was Jean-Claude Perrault.
Yeah. And he just said yes and hung up the phone. And that was the conversation. I enjoyed that. So, was it a difficult task to get men on board with this?
Well, I don't think so at that time. It was interesting. In the 70s, both women and men weren't on board with it. It wasn't just men who weren't on board with it. I think what was interesting about the women's movement was that many women came into the union movement and played that educative role of what are the issues here. And I think the Royal Commission on the Status of Women, its report in the 1970s, which was not only recommending paid maternity, but also recommending affordable quality public daycare and a whole slew of other ways in which family leaves, if you like, in general. So I think that report also was part of the education role, that people could point to that recommendations by the Commission. So I think it wasn't just a matter of getting men in the union movement on board. I think it was a matter of educating everybody about the importance of these kinds of benefits and how that they were union issues. Right. That union wasn't just about getting an increase in pay at the bargaining table. It was about broadening the agenda very widely and thinking about the union negotiations as a part of people's lives, not just their narrow lives in the workplace, but their broader lives in society and at home. And I think that was an important role that women coming from the feminist movement actually brought that somewhat into the union movement, as well as progressive men and women coming from other movements. I can't remember. In a sense, after the postal workers won that game and went on strike for it, it sort of gained total legitimacy within the union movement in some respects. Or as you perhaps have a bit of a different story of your the bargaining movement, bargaining table.
I guess 30 years after you're supposed to open up the archive, so I'll open up a little archive on that. The bargaining committee that set the priorities for clerical workers was 13 women and 3 men, and paid maternity leave actually got voted down initially as a priority demand.
Oh, wow.
The 3 men had all voted for it as a priority, and the other 13 who were women, an absolute majority of the group had voted it down, and we had to have a motion of reconsideration. Unions are full of process. Often it's not an unusual thing for people to say, what did we just do there? We have to go back and look at that again. But it was interesting to say that those were the numbers and that's how it worked. And some of the women who were on the bargaining committee, they'd had children of their own. It took a process of evolution. They felt proud that they'd put money aside and saved to have children. They thought that was a normal process, and it was a new idea to them. On the other hand, one of the members of the committee was from Quebec, from the Supply and Services Union, and he simply said, look, we have this in Quebec. You're crazy not to ask for this. This is a real demand. I know people who have this. And I think that the part of the division, the gender division was important, but also the political division was important. How open were you to progressive issues? How open were you to progressive thinking?
Yeah.
So it was not a tidy process, but it was a very democratic process.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think another good part in the movie is when one of the women says that, when they first presented this idea, one of the counters to them was that they would just go off and have babies all the time, so that they would never have to work. And I guess that's part of this process, and it is sort of sort of educating people of really what it means, and sort of these more outlandish fears of that women are just going to have babies after babies after babies just so they can get time off is kind of ridiculous and outlandish. And so that's part of this process then. Spoke to it a little bit there, Arthur. When you're on a bargaining committee, or just even as a member of a union or a leader in this movement, you're obviously dealing with people who have different priorities and different points of views, but at the same time you do have to present a united front as the union. So how do you deal with that? The back and forth and the negotiation within the union, within the bargaining committee itself, in order to approach the employers with a unified front and a clear mandate for what you're bargaining for.
I guess part of the process with the national union, where people wouldn't have all worked in the same plant and seen each other on the bus every day, the union had to develop a procedure of bringing people in and having familiarization sessions. And one of the things that we would do is go through the process. The formal process was going through all the demands that had been made, and if someone said we want 21 cents an hour raise and someone else said we want 22 cents an hour raise, well, how do you aggregate it? Because you can't ask for a whole bunch of different numbers. What is the number you pick? But the union became increasingly skilled at bringing members in, because the Public Service Alliance was still a relatively young union, and in its early days it had hired people from other unions who had expertise. But there was a gradual empowerment of members going on, where the bargaining team would be composed of members of the unit affected. And the union had an extensive education process, it still does, and the union had a big familiarization process, so that as you worked with people over a period of several weeks to winnow out demands and to come up with composite demands that made sense and hung together in a logical way, you got familiar with people and you developed some trust with people. Within the bargaining team, there was also the whole dynamic of us and them. It might be that you had disagreements behind closed doors, but when you were facing the employer, some of them were taking very extreme positions, some of them were being antagonistic, and I can remember bargaining team members getting up and shouting at people across the table. The us and them mentality may be hard on the stomach and hard on the psychology, but it does intend over time to force some unity within your team. In terms of communicating with members, whether it's a strike or whether it's a collective agreement, one thing the PSAC has always stressed, perhaps more than some of the other federal unions, is the importance of having meetings, the importance that when a tentative agreement comes out, there will be a chance for people to go to a meeting and in most cases meet a member of the bargaining team and say, well, what happened? Why did you get this? Why didn't you get that? And so it's a process of talk, until you get to a position that people can live with. Not always where they started, not often where they started, but something that you can live with.
Right.
It's a process of participatory democracy, right? I mean, it's a process of people engaging, people being allowed to voice their views, people learning, people being educated about certain demands from other unions, like what's happening in Quebec. Most members wouldn't know about that, right? So it's a process of democracy which is a messy business often.
Right.
That kind of democracy, not the kind of, just put your mark on a ballot every 4 or 5 years, but that kind of democracy where people discuss, often don't agree, often at the end of the day do have to take a vote, but nevertheless, as Arthur says, have an opportunity to come and air their viewpoints. And, and it doesn't often go as smoothly as one would like. But I always think the picket line is a great source of democratic process. Because it's on the picket line when you have the time and, to walk and to talk, that people learn a lot and form, get an opportunity to debate and discuss and disagree and take a position. And when they go to the meeting, they've actually had a great discussion at that moment. And people don't think about how that's such an important difference from our normal work lives. That you actually have an opportunity here to engage democratically and discuss, and then at the end of the day, yes, vote.
Well, that sort of leads me to the next question then, because it seems today and we don't really talk to each other as much as we used to. Everyone's sort of on their phone, everything's over email. And so those conversations, even organically in a workplace, maybe don't have the same chance to sort of play out and for people to communicate in that way. And it leads me to the question of, is this movement then over?
Most people working today don't have family leave. Let's start from where this the leave which the PSAC and postal workers, here at Carlton, people do have paid maternity leave and then other paid family leaves. Mm-hmm. But the maternity leave and the parental leave, when you have a child, its starting point is employment insurance. That is, 55% of that payment comes from employment insurance, and then it is topped up through in the case in the federal government, up to 93% of pay through the negotiations that took place at the bargaining table. Mm-hmm. Now, most people who are unemployed aren't on EI.
Right.
They're not getting employment. And particularly young women and young men who are the most likely to need maternity leave and parental leaves are not getting EI. And plus, they're working in workplaces where there is no union contract, so there is no top-up. So, yes, there are some employers like the banks that give paid maternity leave and some paid parental leave. It's very much less. You're lucky if you get, I think 6 months is about the max. But you can't, you've got to be a full-time permanent employee, and a lot of people working front lines in banks aren't, and so they're not getting, they may get the EI part, but they're not getting the top-up. And as we become less unionized, which we are since the 70s and 80s, mm-hmm. There are less people getting other kinds of leaves, because they don't have collective agreements where these leaves have been gained through negotiations and strike. So I would say we're going backwards,
right.
In fact, and the movement, far from being over, needs to be revitalized and remobilized. And,
I would agree with most of those comments. There are dark spots and there are bright spots. And some of the bright spots, one of the things that the video treated with was custom adoption. And in Aboriginal communities, for thousands of years, if you had 5 children and your sister had no children, it wasn't rare that 1 or 2 of your children would be raised by your sister. Whenever we went through the process, and it's a painfully slow process of decolonization in Canada's north, we saw more and more Aboriginal people joining the wage economy. And there was kind of a 2-step process. It was announced that everything was going to be great because it would be under Aboriginal control, and in many cases that was true. But then people suddenly discovered that they weren't getting the same benefits that the white people had been getting. And then they said, what was the phone number of those people who got too many benefits for the previous people? We want their phone number because we'd like to get some benefits too. So in the area of family leave, there's been progress, and it goes back into the 1980s, but it continues to this day, where, for example, at one point under the colonial model, in an Arctic community, you would have the Department of Public Works plowed the roads. They provided the people who repaired your furnace. The Northern Canada Power Commission provided the people who ran the diesel generator. As part of trying to frustrate unions, they made sure that they broke all those up into separate employers, but there's been a large and long process of reunionization in the north. And in terms of family leave, if you do a custom adoption, initially the collective agreement only dealt with white man's law. And so a custom adoption wasn't recognized. So if you wanted to take your child to a medical appointment, if you wanted to take adoption leave, if you wanted various family-related leaves to occur, you potentially would have to deal with court orders, adoption agencies, all kinds of things that were beyond your financial and beyond, in many cases, beyond your cultural norms. In many cases, there have been collective agreements negotiated in Aboriginal languages in their own communities that respect their own way of doing it, so that now, for example, you can go to a justice of the peace in Inuktitut and swear at a deposition that you've adopted this child and you recognize this child as your own, and the collective agreement opens up to you. I think those are encouraging stories, and as we see marginal groups join the paid workforce and get the opportunity for wage employment, the struggle continues, to coin a phrase, for people who are looking at making their own customs and making their own culture be validated in the workplace. That would be one positive example.
But in this struggle then, as Rosemary was saying, and as Arthur, you're saying as well, that we're sort of we're trying to re-up and get people to really focus on these rights that they do have and continue to mobilize so that not only can we continue it, but also not lose what already exists. And this was one of the questions that was asked at the roundtable at the premiere. What does it take to get people mobilized today? Because obviously we live in a different culture than we did in the 70s and early 80s. So what do you think it takes today in 2012 and moving forward to get people mobilized on the same level?
I don't think it's so different
No?
today. I mean, people are on social network, and in fact, I would argue that technology should help with mobilization. But I think it's the same slow business of just going out and making contact with people and working to get them to be educated about the issues of, say, family leaves and what's happening with EI and why is it that the government has, in terms of reducing the services of EI. Now, in terms of appeals, they're lessening the amount of adjudicators. Why is it that so few young unemployed people are eligible for EI? I think we need to do a better job of putting that out there, both as unions and as opposition political parties, about what's happening to people in the paid labour force. That the number of good jobs is diminishing, that the jobs that are available for young people, say, coming out of university just aren't there, right. That they're having to take minimum wage jobs, that those minimum wage jobs often are part-time or seasonal, so they don't accumulate enough hours to get EI if they become pregnant or if they become a parent. We need to do a better job of going back to basics of educating people about what's going on and getting that message out. And I don't think it wasn't easy then, right. And I don't think it's easy now. I think it's a matter of struggle continuing and people, and of course this project Labour History people have done is part of that process.
Yeah. I think that, just to touch on the point, it wasn't easy then. Jean-Claude Perrault was sent to jail. The leaders of the Common Front were sent to jail. Yeah. The leader of the Canadian Union of Public Employees, who represents many of the workers at this university, went to jail. There was a very contentious time, and it was very difficult, and it's no fun being sent to jail. But it tended to delegitimize the government when they did that. People said, look, you have money for all this other stuff. Why do you have to put these people in jail? There are lots of people who do things. Why is collective bargaining suddenly a crime? And I think that some of the history of the labor movement and social movement has been seeing people fight when they see things taken away. If, for example, the sort of strangler approach that the federal Conservatives have to cutting Medicare by setting caps on the funding to the provinces, by not having any dialogue on it. In Canada, we live 4 years longer and we live healthier lives than Americans do. They spend 18% of their gross domestic product on medical care. We spend less than 12%. That's the third rail in politics. I would say that in terms of mobilizing people, whenever people start to see the effects of that hitting, you're going to see more social consultation. You're going to see more people saying, why is there money for an F-35 fighter contract when there's no money for medical care? So it depends on the timing, it depends on the issue. But in the background, there are other changes in our society, like media concentration and narrowcasting instead of broadcasting of information that have really undermined the public's right to know. Some of the other ones are, I guess it's a negative way of seeing validation, but the federal Conservatives have an active campaign now about ending the RAND formula for union dues. To have a union, and going back to when you asked how do you manage to form a united front, well, one of the things is you have to have 50% of the employees, more than 50%, in favor of forming a union before you can form a union. You can't, as the federal government of today, draw 38% of the vote and 25% of the eligible voters and say we're king of the castle. It doesn't work that way. So from the get-go, you have to have a higher margin to be a union, and in a sense that means you're reflecting a broader group of people to begin with, although the disagreements within that group are quite lively.
The exhibit itself, or the project itself, the fruits of all your labor has been this documentary, which is available for purchase.
Yes, institutional copies like universities or unions are $100, individual copies are $20.
And I can vouch for it. It's definitely worth the purchase. It's a great film, and it's available in the movie itself is bilingual, and you can watch it with English subtitles or French subtitles, or you can watch it with just in one version, and where the French is English subtitled and the French.
This is a complicated country that we live in.
Yeah, you can watch it in any way you want. You can with whichever official language you would like to watch it in.
If you're in a bilingual audience, you can run it in
Bilingual.
English with French subtitles.
Right.
And so that, yeah.
Right. And the other is the exhibit, which is available for traveling.
Yes, we provide the exhibit free, but if you're outside of the Ottawa area, you need to provide shipping costs for it. So, for example, it went to the Ontario Secondary School Teachers Federation Convention in Toronto. It is currently running at the Workers' Arts and Heritage Centre in Hamilton, and it's 51 Stewart Street for anybody listening in Southern Ontario. Do drop in. It's a great museum, and they're currently running our exhibit and our video in their community gallery.
Terrific, and it's like it's just you get it, and you roll it out, and you set it up, and it's not a huge
easy.
Production cost for the people who are receiving it, right?
No, it's easy to put up and easy to take down, and lightweight. It's bilingual as well, and we think it's an attractive look at it and a good introduction to the video. There's also some posters and some educational material that we've developed in support of that. And we'd like a new generation of students, whether at university or high school level, to learn more about the struggle for family leave. And to the best of our knowledge, when we began this project, nobody else had done anything on this area. And we hope that students will find interesting papers in the future and use our archives at the Workers' History Museum to do further research and to talk more and to keep this dialogue alive.
Yeah, it's a great project, great documentary, great exhibit. And for more information on it, you can go to info.workershistory.ca for information on the Workers' History Museum. They also have a blog at workershistorymuseum.blogspot.ca, which I used in following this project through the launch a few weeks ago. And there's also some good book reviews up there, some of the labor history books, which are very well written. I enjoyed those. And you can also follow them on Twitter at Workers History for all the information updates on some of the various events, like the movie launch. We also had a fun event with the train, right?
Train whistles and trolley cars in the park. Our museum is currently working on a project with the City of Ottawa about Britannia Park, which was, there used to be trolley cars that went out there, and it was a big part of people's memory in this community. If you couldn't afford a vacation, you could afford 5 cents for a trolley car.
Yeah, so that's great. You guys are doing great work, and we wish you all the best of luck moving forward, and congratulations on this project. It's a really great thing.
Thank you, John.
So that is Rosemary Warskett and Arthur Carkner talking about the Family Leave Project. Thank you both for doing this. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, so we're back from Carleton University, back up there on the north side of the city. And I just wanted to take some time. This is the last episode that we're doing in 2012, and I just want to take a few seconds just to thank some people. First, I want to start with Adam Walls. He is the voice of the History Slam. He's the one who greets you at the start of each episode and says the farewell at the end of each episode. I want to thank him for doing that, and him and his wife Kelly actually just had a baby a little while ago, and even with that, he still showed up every time we recorded to do that voiceover. So we appreciate that. So thank you, Adam. I want to thank everyone at Active History for their help and their support. Jay Young, who was helpful in getting us Glenn McKnight for the last podcast. He's been great. Jim Clifford has been a ton of help with some of the technical stuff and with the iTunes stuff as well. And probably the biggest thank you that I owe personally goes to Ian Milligan. He's the one who I first talked to about this idea and getting the podcast going, and he's been very supportive. And anyone who's ever been involved in TV says that you need a champion for your show if you're going to be successful. And at least for this podcast, I would say Ian has been sort of the champion of the podcasts. And to him, I'm very appreciative for his support and his help along the way. And to everybody else at Active History, my sincere thank you for all your help and being so supportive. It's been a lot of fun putting these episodes together, and I look forward to continuing it in 2013, unless the Mayans are right, and then, well, it's been fun till now. Finally, I also want to thank everyone who's listened to, whether it be all the episodes, one episode, part of some episodes, whatever it is. To everyone who's listened, it means a lot to me that people have been so positive in their response to the podcast. I have a lot of fun putting them together, and most of the feedback I've gotten from the guests has been very positive as well in terms of the reaction that they've received from people who've listened to the podcast. So I couldn't be more happy with how the process has gone, and to everyone who's been on the podcast, thanks so much for making the podcast what it is. So with that, I will wish everybody a happy holiday season and a happy new year. We will see everybody in 2013, hopefully. If you have any questions, comments for the podcast, as always, historyslam@gmail.com. You can find me on Twitter at Dr. Shawnee Fever. And until next time, if you're out and you see Enrico Palazzo, please say hi for me.
Thanks for listening to the History Slam podcast. Check out ActiveHistory.ca for more features and articles, and be sure to subscribe on iTunes.